Much has been said about Joseph Kennedy's connections with the underworld. But, in his early days, was the father of the future President of the United States a bootlegger during Prohibition? Let's check it out. I'm James Gladwish and welcome to OC Shorts, bringing you detailed historical snapshots of the American Mafia and other organised crime. Feel free to subscribe if you like that sort of thing. Today, we are going to take a quick look at whether Joseph Kennedy, father of President John F. Kennedy, was a bootlegger during the days of Prohibition. Owney Madden, Joseph Bonanno, and Frank Costello were three famous mobsters who are often linked with stating that Joseph Kennedy was a bootlegger during Prohibition. However, there may well be some holes in these accounts. For example, Owney the Killer Madden, the powerful mobster who dominated Hell's Kitchen and other parts of Manhattan during Prohibition, once allegedly claimed that he sold Joseph Kennedy's liquor in his nightclubs. However, Owney Madden may well be confusing President Kennedy's father with another Joseph Kennedy. Liquor businessman David Joseph Kennedy, who went by his middle name Joseph, developed Kennedy's Jazz Cocktails and Kennedy's Silk Hat Cocktails. These drinks were produced in Canada and smuggled into the US by Joseph Kennedy Limited, a Canadian company based in Vancouver, and founded by D. Joseph Kennedy. This Joseph Kennedy's bottles can be seen in this photo. In his early career at the turn of the century, while living in New York City, this Joseph Kennedy was a liquor buyer for Nathan Strauss, the co-owner of Macy's. He would move to Canada prior to World War I and started developing his cocktails, and founded his company in the early 1920s. A few years later, he would sell his company to the Rifle Brothers of Vancouver. And in 1927, the Canadian government would accuse this Joseph Kennedy of smuggling liquor into the United States. Sources often state that future mob boss Joseph Bonanno knew Joe Kennedy during the days of Prohibition. However, in Joseph Bonanno's autobiography, A Man of Honor, he states, "When I shook hands with John Kennedy, I thought of his dad, Joe Kennedy. When I lived in New York, I would sometimes go to Sag Harbor, Long Island in the summer. This was one of the coves, so I was told, that the Kennedy people used to transport whiskey during Prohibition." This paragraph from Joe Bonanno's book clearly states that Bonanno had only heard a rumour that the Kennedys were involved in liquor smuggling during Prohibition. But, as can be seen, Bonanno had no first-hand knowledge of Joe Kennedy being a bootlegger. I sat down with mob historian Eric Desenhall, author of the excellent book Wise Guys and the White House, to discuss the claims that Joseph Kennedy was a bootlegger during Prohibition. So Eric, from your research that you've conducted, was Joseph Kennedy a bootlegger during the days of Prohibition?
Joe Kennedy was not a bootlegger. There's no evidence that he was. He was in the liquor business, but he was in the liquor business before Prohibition, and his family was, and he was in the liquor business afterward. What he did during Prohibition is he purchased liquor companies overseas. And because he was very concerned, he didn't want to be an Irish liquor guy, but it was fine to be a British distiller. So he bought a company in England and renamed it Somerset Distillers. Somerset was the name of a very waspy club, social club in Boston that he could not get into, which tells you an awful lot. He also invested in alcohol for medicinal purposes, some of which was during Prohibition. And ultimately, he did do business after Prohibition, big liquor business in the United States. One of his partners was none other than James Roosevelt, the president's son. because it was very important to him to show he was a prestigious kind of guy. James Roosevelt was not in the liquor end of the business. He was in the shipping and insurance end of the business. One of Joe Kennedy's other partners was somebody you might have heard of named Winston Churchill. He was an investor in Joe Kennedy's companies. What's very interesting to me is that people have a deep psychic belief in believing Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger. In fact, of all the things I say in my books, one of them that makes people angriest is that Joe Kennedy wasn't a bootlegger. I mean, I get threats. Why do you care so much? What is the need to believe this? Now, the fact is where Joe Kennedy did make his money, because I don't want people to think my conclusion is that he was a sweet guy. In fact, he was a real rough customer, but he was really slick and really smart and kind of diabolical. He made most of his money in what is today called insider trading, which in those days was not a crime. It was a frowned upon practice. Well, Roosevelt was looking at this and he started under his administration, the Securities and Exchange Commission. Guess who he appointed as the first chair? Joe Kennedy. Joe Kennedy was investigated for government positions at least four times. Nothing was found on bootlegging. He was investigated when JFK ran for Senate. Nothing was found. The Nixon people who wanted JFK absolutely destroyed investigated him and found nothing. And these things certainly would have come up. There are a few things that I think we have to keep in mind when we look at the idea of Joe Kennedy being a boot being dealing with the whole mob world. He did. He dealt with the mob world as an investor in gambling, most likely in Florida in racetracks and in Nevada, where he, through fronts, had investments. But his biggest mob dealings came with his ownership of the Chicago Merchandise Mart, the largest at the time building in the world, where he needed mob help. So the issue here is not, oh, this author is saying he's some kind of sweetheart. He's not. In fact, the only thing that we can really find about bootlegging that could be seen as that was that he supplied liquor at one of his Harvard reunions, which, you know, if you want to consider that bootlegging, fine. What's interesting is when I get into arguments with people about this, they say, yeah, but you're just being technical. That technically, if he was doing some of these things, buying alcohol for medicinal purposes, um, uh, buying liquor companies during Prohibition, but keeping it overseas. But you know, James, technical is everything.
Mm.
Um, you have, I mean, you have casinos today that are making people legal billionaires because they are technically legal. The fact that the mob controlled gambling at one time was illegal. In Havana, because they controlled the government, it was legal. So when we talk about technical, well, yeah, I think technical's everything.
So, from all the things you just listed, obviously the fact that there were these kind of known kind of mob connections, the fact that he did have legal ownery of distilleries, obviously over in the UK. Is this where this kind of this myth has kind of perpetuated from, so to speak?
This myth really started. And by the way, I should add that two of the most ruthless biographers of Joe Kennedy couldn't find anything. This is not just me. I mean, they marveled at it, and nobody has more incentive than a biographer to find the
Yeah.
dirt. Where this comes from is in the mid 60s and 70s, the bootlegging rumors really started. And it started because mob guys did what mob guys do very well. They gossip and they tell stories. And there were people like Frank Costello, who was the prime mover
Yeah.
in retirement of this. And one of the things you have with guys like Costello and also Meyer Lansky is they were obsessed with the concept of we're no different than they are. They were different. They were different in the sense that what they were doing was at that time a crime. And so what they started to do was saying we did business with Joe Kennedy. Well, the fact is Joe Kennedy was in the liquor world. He also, and I think this is important, he bought and sold companies from people who had been in bootlegging. So there's no question that he was in that world. But he was so clever because the last thing Joe Kennedy would want to do was get involved with the most violent business there was in the country, which was bootlegging. They were the equivalent in those days of what drug cartels have been in
Mm.
recent decades. Here you are, this multimillionaire, today's equivalent of a billionaire. You're making money in banking, you're making money in real estate, in finance, in Hollywood. You're going to do what it would be like Warren Buffett in the 1980s saying, you know what, I'm going to run a Mexican drug cartel. Not only that, but this was someone with ambition to become president, for his kids to become president. And this was an industry where the government, the federal government, not so much local governments, were cracking down. You had thousands of people getting killed in the bootlegging wars. You had 50 to 100,000 people who died by consuming alcohol that was somewhat sketchy. There's no way he would become involved with something like that. But where the rumors happened is it snowballed. It started with Costello. Lansky made comments later on. And my favorite thing is, today they call these things memes. I cannot tell you how many times I have heard from people, my grandfather or my uncle saw Joe Kennedy on the docks supervising shipments. This is the same thing as, I mean, I can tell you as a fellow researcher, I have been told dozens of times by people, Meyer Lansky used to bounce me on his knee when I was a child. That same wording. I get letters and emails from people who want to write me to write their story. Carlo Gambino saw me like a son. Albert Anastasia was very much a father figure to me. It's the same type of, I don't want to call them lies because I don't think these people are malicious.
Yeah.
I think these stories are fun. And I think people take a hard kernel of truth about something they want to believe, and it snowballs into something else.
I think you may be right. So, I mean, if we look at two of the Costello biographies, obviously this one by Anthony DeStefano and this one by Leonard Katz. In both these books, there is probably about two paragraphs which mention a Kennedy relationship. If there was any concrete evidence linking major underworld figure Frank Costello with Joe Kennedy, there would be pages in the books, in my opinion. Um, and in fact, one of them, as you said, is that kind of story. There was, I think it's the son of one of his lawyers had once walked in and asked him a question, "Oh, who you on the phone to?" And he said, "Oh, it's just that Kennedy guy from Boston." But this again, it's like a story of a story. You know, it's a third hand kind of story. And even if Costello had joked, Costello might have even been joking if he even said that. You know, but I think it was a guy called Stephen Smith who was one of Joe Kennedy's son-in-laws.
Right.
Apparently, he said that the family went through all the business records and there was no indication of any business relationship with Frank Costello from the Kennedys. I mean, look, people will argue, oh, if they did something, it'd be off the books anyway, or
Right.
they keep it all quiet. But they can only look at what they can look at. And the son-in-law looked through the records, and there was no indication of any business relationship between Joe Kennedy and Frank Costello. And I think you're right. I think it's one of those things that people just kind of want to believe.
Well, one of the things that I had to come to terms with when I started in this area decades ago was, do you want to be a student of organized crime, or do you want to talk about mafia myths, mafia
Yeah.
fairy tales? And as the author Philip Roth once said, the big money is in fairy tales. The big money is the idea that Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger and he got away with it, and his son became president.
Yeah.
The truth is, he was a rough guy who had mob connections, but he was not a bootlegger. But what do you do when you have something that is today called the Mandela effect, which you can look up? It is the belief, like a lot of people believe Nelson Mandela, they remember that he died in the 1980s when he didn't. But you have this whole list of phenomena. And whenever people say Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger, it's always with a smirk. It's, let me tell you something, James. I got some dirt here. I know Joe Kennedy was a bootlegger. And you have to always ask, why do you need to believe this so badly? Why are you fighting me on something where you don't have backup other than, hey, I know a guy whose barber's uncle lived in Boston. And one of the things you should know that you brought up is apparently there was a Kennedy clan of people, a family that was involved with bootlegging. I mean, it was not an unusual name. We really don't know exactly who they are. We don't know if one of them was a Joe. But you also have to keep in mind, if you were Stephen Smith, the son-in-law of Kennedy, and you were in charge of running these campaigns, you are an Oppo guy, what we call in America an Oppo. You are looking for how they're going to come at you. And, they were worried about the women.
Yeah.
They were worried. The thing they were really scared of was JFK's illnesses, but they really weren't worried about the bootlegging issue because there was nothing there. And if you trace where the rumors started to hemorrhage, it was not unlike the Kennedy assassination. It was all at way after where people started to come up with these fun theories. And I'll give you this, it's a lot of fun.
In the comments below, let me know your thoughts on the topic covered in this video. I've included the link to Eric's excellent book, Wise Guys and the White House, in the comments below. I hope you found that interesting. Thanks for watching.